you should not only look at the source of a page, but also look at the rendered version. And as I said, View Rendered Source, the extension by John Hogg is awesome for that. Sidebulb has a great comparison in their crawler, and more people should just check this. I see a lot of people not checking this and thus failing to solve some issues. Hi, I'm Arnout, and this is SEO in 2026.
Arnout, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
I feel like people really need to look at their technical setup. And with that, I mean the rendered version versus the raw HTML, especially with a lot of AI crawlers not rendering yet, but also because I've seen a lot of discrepancies in that part.
Understood. So is the rendered version typically quite different for different search engines?
Well, as with a lot of things in SEO, it depends, right? Sometimes when websites are being built using JavaScript frameworks, the content is actually different in the raw HTML versus the rendered HTML. So titles might be different. There might not be schema markup. There might be different headings. There might be whatever, because those are being changed by the execution of JavaScript. And that can severely impact the discoverability of your page.
So what does this mean then for the use of JavaScript over the next few years?
Well, you might see it this way, right? Crawling a website using a rendered version, it takes a lot of energy from a browser. So you actually need to render the pages. So most would rather just scrape the page, get the raw HTML, and get all the elements. And I think currently this is why a lot of the AI crawlers, OpenAI, Perplexity, and et cetera, it's just too expensive for them to do it. Microsoft with Bing and Google are doing it. The thing is, you can properly implement this, right? With pre-render solutions, with like hybrid solutions. So there's loads of ways to work around it. So it's not the death of the JavaScript, but I feel JavaScript has added a lot of technical difficulties that feel scary for most people in SEO. So most people don't even know how to do this, right? It took me a while to figure it out. So it's definitely not the death, because JavaScript has given us loads, interactive elements and all kinds of things, but it's something people should be aware of, especially with all these new crawlers popping up, right? And you want the content to be seen by AI crawlers as well as search engines, right?
So what does an SEO need to do in order to determine how their website is seen by AI crawlers?
So for one, there's a free extension in Chrome, which is View Rendered Source, which will show you the difference between the raw HTML and the rendered source. The other thing is, if you use a crawler, look at the difference between the raw HTML and the rendered HTML. I really enjoy using Sidebulb for that, because it will literally show you these links were added using JavaScript, or this piece of content has changed because of JavaScript, or these images are being rendered through the execution of JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera.
Got you. Okay. But you obviously say that AI search engines can see things quite differently to other search engines. You mentioned Microsoft there as well as Google. So how do you determine how they specifically see things differently, and what do you do about it to ensure that they have a better idea of what's on your web pages?
Well, basically, they only look at the raw HTML. So what you see in the raw HTML is what they can see. So if your images aren't visible in there, then they won't see the images. If your page title isn't filled in, or there's no headings in the raw HTML, then that's what they are seeing.
So does that need to be corrected then, quite simply?
Yeah. In an ideal situation, the raw HTML and the rendered HTML is basically the same, right? That's the fastest your web page will be a lot faster because there's no JavaScript execution needed to render the page in an ideal situation. Is that always possible? No, but you should get as close as possible because it makes everything faster and there won't be any indexation problems. It's way easier. Like back in the days, we would just look at the raw HTML and that was it. Nowadays, it's a lot more difficult.
So how does an SEO prioritize what needs to be done? If they're working on a big website, hundreds of thousands of pages, and they've got an issue with the non-rendered version, and not everything obviously coming through the raw HTML, do you prioritize certain elements that should be incorporated, or do you prioritize certain pages?
Yeah, for sure. The basics are the most important, right? So it's making sure that the core content of the page can be read. So this means the headings, page title, your images, et cetera, because that's what you want in the index. That certain elements are not working, or for instance, a footer is not working, and like that's not the biggest issue. So you need to prioritize on having all the elements in the raw HTML, and they should not change, right? What I see a lot, or have seen, is that when the page gets rendered, the elements are still the same, but they've been taken away and inserted again, which gives search engines like, what's happening here? Because I thought I had the H1 and now the H1 is somewhere else. It's still the same H1.
If you have a JavaScript menu, do you need to prioritize the inclusion of HTML links to all the other pages in your site, or can it be sufficient to actually just use an XML sitemap for that?
Well, an XML sitemap is always a good idea, but the challenge with links in like these mega menus is when you switch off JavaScript, try doing it, right? Just switch off JavaScript in your browser using a NoScript plugin or whatever, and then try browsing your own website. Might be very hard.
Yeah.
So in an ideal situation, you want the internal linking to keep working. But the biggest priority is getting the content and the right markup. So the heading, the page title, and your content in the index. Like that's the most important part.
And does this all impact brand visibility? Obviously, there are different features in the SERP. There are elements within AI search engine results that give brands a greater prominence. If you have certain elements incorporated with the HTML, I guess it gives you that increased brand visibility.
Well, yeah, but most search engines will first crawl and index the raw HTML and then render the page and then compare it to the original and then say, hey, should I overwrite this? But for instance, say you would use JavaScript to insert structured data. That might be an issue because there might be a delay of the structured data being rendered. So for instance, a product might be out of stock, but now it's in stock on your website, but because the page hasn't been rendered, Google still think it's out of stock. So that's why those particular elements are really important to have in your raw HTML, not your rendered, or not only in your rendered.
How do you know which elements are likely to have the biggest impact on rankings? I mean, for instance, you obviously talked about basic HTML markup. Sorry.
I think, again, it's a bit of an it depends, right? So say you would have review stars. If you're using JavaScript to insert that part of the code, it might not appear for all the pages immediately, right? So then that is an important element. But say you would have like headings changing. So there's no headings in the raw HTML, but there is in the rendered. Now that will impact the ranking of a new article. Eventually it will fix itself once the indexed version or the rendered version gets indexed. But initially you won't benefit from the work you did.
And I guess this conversation obviously emphasizes the importance of including these elements in selecting a new CMS. If you're looking to hopefully create the next version of your website, then you've got to make sure that it incorporates the non-rendered web page version as readable by various search engines, modern search engines.
Yeah, and I see a lot of headless CMSs popping up, right? Like Storyblok, et cetera, and they usually have a JavaScript-based app and if you don't use a pre-render solution, so basically a server version that will render the page and serve to search engines and users a fully rendered page. If you don't have anything like that, it will impact everything.
Is there a CMS that you're particularly fond of, or a CMS that you'd like to shout out as not doing a good job?
I think any CMS can be adjusted to be able to serve this, right? It's a little more work, but it can be done. Most of the traditional CMSs that use less JavaScript, which basically, well, the core elements will just be there. You should just be aware, right? And I feel a lot of people are not aware. They say, I see a lot of use cases for React-based applications or websites, but there's also a lot of cases where you shouldn't. If you're making loads of changes, you don't need a developer for everything. You better go for a fairly more standard CMS out of the box, whether it's WordPress, Drupal, or whatever, or one of those builders like Wix or Duda or whatever, than building something with the React front end, because that will create these problems. But I think we should be aware that this is happening. And I see a lot of people that are a little scared of doing SEO this way.
And obviously it can be a lot of work to do this as well. So do you actually implement the changes on some kind of test and learn basis to analyze the impact of what you're having? And also, if you're going to do that, how do you have that conversation with stakeholders internally to demonstrate the impact of what you're doing?
I think you first need to understand what's happening, and you use tools like View Rendered Source. But I've had projects where it would also be dependent on user agent, what IP you were in, aka what country. So it's difficult. But then I think once you've understood what the problem is, you can build a case around it fairly easily. Because, say, for instance, the structured data is, the review snippet is gone for some pages, and other pages it's still in. You can basically say, well, the CTR of these pages, the click-through rate is a lot higher than for these pages, so it's highly likely has to do with this.
Got you. So Arnout, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
That you should not only look at the source of a page, but also look at the rendered version. And as I said, View Rendered Source, the extension by John Hogg, is awesome for that. Sidebulb has a great comparison in their crawler, and more people should just check this. I see a lot of people not checking this and thus failing to solve some issues.
And how much of an SEO's time should be spent on doing this?
I guess it depends, but if you are going to work on a React-based platform, like, a lot of time to fix this and monitor it, because sometimes it breaks and then you get like unforeseen errors. Like, for instance, the pre-rendering stops failing or stops working, then you have a big problem. And most people aren't looking at that. It depends on what kind of platform. If you don't use any JavaScript in the front end or hardly any, it's less of an issue, right? So again, it depends.
Arnout Hellemans is a freelance tech SEO and analytics consultant. Find out more over at onlinemarketthink.com. Arnout, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
All good. Thank you for having me.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.